If you're autistic like me, even if you don't know you're actually autistic, you're probably aware that those around you, neurotypical people, have a set of social skills and possibly people skills that you don't have, that you were not born with. And we're often led to believe, I know I was, that we can't learn, or that just it for us, we're stuck. But as someone who worked in sales for 20 years, I can promise you that's not true. And one of the tools that I used in my early days in the mid-90s was a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. This podcast episode is dedicated to the fourth installment from that book. I'm calling it installment because this isn't chapter 4, it's part 2, chapter 1. The first 3 chapters of the book are considered to be part 1, and I've already covered those in the prior episodes of this podcast. Although it would be better for you to go back and listen or watch those episodes. This on its own will make sense to you. You can watch this first and then go back if you want to. It starts off as saying 6 ways to make people like you, with the statement, do this and you'll be welcome anywhere. At the start of the chapter, Dale Carnegie talks about the greatest winner of friends that we've ever known. He's actually referring to dogs. And he goes on to explain about, what it's like when a dog comes up to you, it wags its tail and is so friendly. And, unlike other creatures, it's not doing it for any reason. It just is so glad to see you. It doesn't want to sell you anything. It just wants to love you and to be loved in return. No ulterior motives, in other words. And this is when he starts talking about being genuinely interested in other people. So what does that look like? And I'm going to talk about it from an autistic perspective because I didn't know I was autistic when I read this. I didn't know for 20 years of my sales career that I was autistic. So I'm talking about how this came across to me and how I use these tools. And Dale makes this statement here. You can make more friends in 2 months by being genuinely interested in other people than you can in 2 years of trying to get others interested in you. And given that this book was written in the 30s and hearing what he's about to talk about now is quite bizarre. Back in those days, they surveyed the most common words spoken on the telephone, privacy laws, anyone, and they discovered back in those days the most common word spoken was I. And just to illustrate this point about us being interested in ourselves, you think about if you see a group photograph and you're in it, what do? You look for yourself first. And look, I know that's what we all do, but the idea of this is to recognise that that's what everyone else is doing. But conversely, if you're the one, if you meet somebody and all they do is talk about themselves, they never check in, they never ask you any questions, it's not a fun experience. And I know we as autistic people, we have a thing of info dumping. And if you're not familiar, it's a subject that we're passionate about and we'll talk a lot about. And that's all well and good. But it's also good to show interest. And what if someone else has got something they want to info dump about? They're going to think the word of you if you ask them about their special interest. But as you'll see as we go on, generally speaking, people are very interested in talking about themselves. And here we have a quote from Alfred Adler. It is the individual who is not interested in his fellow men who has the greatest difficulties in life and provides the greatest injury to others. It is from among such individuals that all human failures spring. And then back in the day, there was this magician named Howard Thurston, and he'd passed away in 1936, to give you an idea how long ago this is. I didn't know about this guy, but in his day, he was the most famous magician. And Dale Carnegie had a chance to talk to him, and he asked Howard, what was the key to his success? And believe it or not, the key to his success, he believed, was the way he thought about his audience, and the way that differentiated him from other people was that he liked his audience, he appreciated his audience, and not only that, he would even say before he went on stage each night, I love my audience, I love my audience. Do you think of anyone in whatever field where they have to work with people? Have you ever worked with someone who has this attitude that says things like, this job would be all right if it wasn't for the damn customers, patients, whatever it might be? I don't know about you, I hear that and think, wow, that's weird. Why are you working here then? Me, back in the day, look, in the early 2000s, I started working for this new company, and there was this older guy there who was just about to retire. He'd been in sales forever. And I was really rapt that he commented about me. His comment was that I have fun and I enjoy my customers. Now, if you've got a dirty mind, you might think something that means something else, but he meant that I enjoyed talking to them and stuff, and I wasn't feeling pressure to get them to do anything. I was just there to help, and I saw them as these people that wanted help and wanted me to do that. And he would talk about Theodore Roosevelt, one of the famous presidents from America. If you're not from there, it says that even servants and people like that in the White House absolutely loved him, even before he was the president, apparently. And he talks about this guy, James Amos, who was, it's referred to as a valet in here, but when I looked up Mr. Amos, he was a bodyguard as well or something. But this gentleman and his wife lived in the cottage on the Roosevelt estate. And it turns out one day this Mr. Amos's wife, Annie, she was talking to the president, and they were talking about this bird called a bob white. I didn't know there was such a bird called a bob white. Anyway, and they had to talk about it, and he told her what they look like. And then a few days later, he rings this little cottage. The president rings the cottage and starts talking to Annie and says, hey, there's a bob white out your window right now. If you look, you might see it. Wow, that's just amazing to me to think that someone so important, so high up, has the time and the foresight to even just think about someone else like that. He's got nothing to gain by that. He's not trying to sell her anything. He's just not only is he being nice, it's thoughtful. Right? People say there's two kinds. There's people who are nice and there's people who are kind. You think that is kind and thoughtful thing to do, and it takes a little bit of effort to do that. But if you do that to people, you are thoughtful, it really does make someone's day. It's not money. It doesn't cost you anything. Then he goes on to talk about one of his students in his course, Dale Carnegie's course, and this bloke is a Johnson & Johnson rep. And one day he goes and visits one of the drugstores that he sells to, and the owner says, I don't want to buy anything off you anymore. Your company concentrates too much on the bulk stores, the discount stores, and us little, small stores get ignored. We don't want to deal with you anymore. And this Johnson & Johnson rep, apparently was quite shattered by this and did nothing all day except drive around thinking about what he was going to say. And eventually, hours later, he did return to this drugstore to speak to the owner. But when he went in there, he got a different attitude. The store owner was happy to see him now. And this rep was like, what's changed? What happened since I left here? And what happened after he got kicked out, after the owner told this rep, we don't want to buy for you anymore, all of the staff came up to the owner and said, hey, that guy's one of the good blokes. He's the only one, or one of few people that come in here, reps or people wanting to sell you stuff, that even talk to us. He knows our names, he says hello to us and shows interest in it. And he's got nothing to gain by doing that, so we can tell that he's a good bloke for doing it. If anyone deserves business, it's this guy. And that alone, he ended up getting double his business, apparently, after this. Then there was another example from another student from his course where this gentleman needed to know something about banking, so he was encouraged to go to the president of the bank. That's what the title was. And he'd made an appointment and everything with this president of the bank, and he's in there talking, asking him all these questions, and in the middle of it was apparently, the way this sounds is like a movie, that the receptionist popped her head into the office and said, oh, we don't have any more stamps today, postage stamps. And then this president of the bank says, oh, look, yeah, I'm collecting some stamps for my 12-year-old son. And this bloke interviewing him doesn't bat an eyelid at that, but continues the interview and gets nowhere. This president doesn't really want to tell him very much. And then he goes back to the course, speaks to Dale Carnegie and tells him the whole story. And Dale says, go back and do nothing but say, hey, I've got some postage stamps for you. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the stamps that are literally on snail mail as we know it these days, It was, I think people probably still collect them, but it was quite common back then. And even in my day, people still collected postage stamps. So it's the only way I've said. There was no email back in those days when I was a kid. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about. So Dale has instructed this bloke to go back to the president of this bank and then say, hey, look, I've got some postage stamps for your son. And nothing else, not to try to say, hey, here's the stamps. Can we have another interview? Nothing. Just, hey, just thought I'd bring in, because it turned out this student of the course, his job, I can't remember who he was, but he had a lot of stamps in his workplace. So it was easy for him to do this. And it wasn't that easy to get your hands on postage stamps apart from buying new ones. But anyway, so he did that. And then it turned out, just because he came back and gave this guy postage stamps, the president of this bank now has all the time in the world and sits there telling him all this information and decides to redo the interview for him. But again, you see the pattern here. He showed genuine interest, but being genuine means that he's not doing it with an ulterior motive, like the example of the dog earlier. And then the last story that he talks about is a gentleman named Mr. Napoli. This is one of his students also, who he scores. And Mr. Napoli sells fuel. And there's this, they call them chain stores, but in this day and age, that's all there is pretty much. I don't think there's really many independent fuel stations. But back in those days, there was a lot of independents, and these chain stores were, seen to be some kind of a plague, and people didn't like them. And this Mr. Napoli was trying to sell to one of the chain stores and was getting nowhere. And, he came back to the course, Dale Carnegie's course, and stated that, chain stores, the bane of humanity, he said they were horrible. And then that was, Dale heard that and was like, let's look at this from a different angle, and here's a challenge for you. So based on that statement, Dale decided to host a debate, for and against chain stores. And Mr. Napoli was tasked with being for or pro the chain stores, the stores that he despises. Now he's been instructed that he has to defend them and he has to speak from their point of view, which led to the next thing. So he's called up the manager of one of these chain stores. I think the guy might have been in charge of more than one store, but let's just say it's the manager of one of these chain stores. And so he's rang him and said, hey, do you have time to talk to me? I'm not here to sell you fuel. And told the manager of the chain store about the debate. And Mr. Napoli said, can I sit down and talk to you and ask you about your stores? So that's all I want to do. I'm not trying to sell anything. And the guy spent like nearly 2 hours talking to this Mr. Napoli, as well as that dragged in some bloke who'd written a book about it. And it was eye-opening for him, hearing this other side of this story, hearing the side of this person or this people that he despised. And it turns out he just didn't know very much about them. And then because of that, because all he did was sit there and show interest and listen to this guy's point of view and what it is to be a chain store owner, or what it is to operate as a chain store, and seeing all the benefits and the differences from independent stores. At the end of all that, this manager puts his arm around Mr. Napoli and says, come and see me in spring and I'll give you some order for fuel. So all these years he's tried to get this guy to buy fuel. He couldn't get anything out of him. But all it takes for him to sit down and say, talk about yourself for nearly 2 hours. And that was it. And then now this guy wants to buy some fuel. And then he has a quote here. We are interested in others when they are interested in us. And then he has a caution. A show of interest must be sincere. It should pay off for the person showing interest and for the person receiving the attention. It's a two-way street. And I'm always keeping in the back of my head that post that I mentioned in one of these episodes. There's some post on Reddit where somebody had asked, is it worth reading this book, How to Win Friends That Influence People? And people were generally very positive about it, but one person made this comment, which surprised me. Not that they made the comment, but so many people upvoted this comment, claiming that a psychopath in their town read this book, and then from that point on, it was hell for the rest of us, with the implication being, and I'm imagining that none of the people who upvoted this, or the person who wrote that, had read this book. And since then I've quite tried to see, is it possible to weaponise this? Every chapter I keep this in mind and think, I don't know how you could weaponise this. But this one, possibly, if you were not doing what he said and you weren't showing genuine interest, you were faking interest, I guess you could weaponise that. But there are also other people in the autistic community that believe that this book is about masking. I guess that's their opinion. I didn't find it that way. It's taken me about 5 years to try to understand my masking, and it's a very hard thing to do, to understand what traits, what little habits you picked up to try to hide your autism and hide who you really are. And I truly don't believe any of this is that. And I believe that you can do that and still be true to yourself without masking that you're autistic. I don't believe that that's what you need to do to implement the skills from this book. So if you've got any questions about any of this, pop it in the comments below. If you've got some experience surrounding this or implementing a skill like the one mentioned in this chapter, please chuck it in the comments below. And in the meantime, take care out there.